Hey everybody, welcome to another episode this week of That 70s Pod in Florida. I am Andrew. Up there in the Midwest, we got Bryan Lee. It's just that time of year where Happy New Year, everybody. Happy New Year once again. I know we said that last week, but Happy New Year. It's January, it's cold, it gets dark. Our skin is dry, our body hurts, so that means it's winter, and it also means the playoffs of the football or the NFL football are here. I spent my New Year's Eve watching like Penn State against Boise, Idaho. Not a big college fan, but just always fun seeing all these important football games happen. And speaking of, I won't give all the details, but I work for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, as we've said that in the past, and we are going to the playoffs again. Back-to-back division winners. So congrats to Tampa Bay. Hashtag Go Bucks. So that is exciting. We'll be doing a playoff game next week. And I'm going to leave it at that. But I'm going to pop it over, or I'm going to throw a Hail Mary up to Wisconsin, where we have Bryan Lee sitting there. How are you doing today, Bryan?
Well, it's you mentioned it's January. It's cold. It was 2 degrees above zero when I was out working this morning. At 4 o'clock this morning, with a little bit of wind, so the wind chill was probably around 10 below. And if you're in some warm part of the country and have no idea what it feels like to have temperatures around zero, you're lucky. But growing up in the Midwest, growing up in Minnesota, Wisconsin, it's just something you get used to. I've always said that you can dress for cold weather. You can put on a couple of pairs of pants and 3 shirts and a couple of pairs of socks and gloves, and you can dress for cold weather, but you can't necessarily dress for hot weather, because when it's hot, and Andrew being in Florida, you know what I'm talking about, on those hot, humid days when it's 100 degrees and the humidity feels like 3,000. I mean, you can wear the least amount of clothing possible, but you're still uncomfortable. So at least in the wintertime, you can dress for it.
Yeah, because today when I woke up and started driving, it's 40 degrees, which is 40 degrees last night. That's pretty cold for Florida. And right now it's exactly 70 degrees. It feels pretty nice outside, and it's not windy at all. And I know what you're saying with that humidity, because when I first moved to Florida, I was living with someone that, for money reasons, didn't ever want to turn the AC on in our apartment. So it was just always muggy and really gross. And they still live like that to this day. And so it was hard for me to get used to the weather. I always felt kind of sick. I always had to wear a white T-shirt, wear my hair up like in a bun. My car at the time didn't have AC. So I thought like Florida was pretty miserable. I'm better now. Living with AC, working in AC, my car has AC, and air conditioner is a huge must, pretty much. Like you want that air conditioner. Like I have the air conditioner on just a little bit right now, just because of my outfit. But yeah, like that muggy feeling sucks. But Orlando, we're covered by a lot of water, and that's always nice. And man, I swear we're part time, like a weather podcast for what we talk about so much. But a lot of weather affects football games. And surprisingly enough, we're going to talk about part 2 of the Super Bowls today. And I was thinking about it the other day. I've never seen a Super Bowl that had bad weather. And maybe that's by design. Maybe if they're up in the Midwest, they're going to go somewhere where there's a roof. And maybe that's why I've never seen a Super Bowl like at Lambeau Field or anything in my life. And everything was like in California or Miami or something like that. So I know we're going to touch on the last few Super Bowls in the 70s today, but have you ever seen, other than a power outage in 2013, have you ever seen a Super Bowl that was affected by the weather?
Well, yeah, the one in Florida, it's got to be at least 10 years ago, between was it the Bears and the Colts? There was a constant downpour, and it just kept raining harder. And Prince, when he was still alive, did the halftime show, And
That's
he
right.
was out there at midfield in pouring rain, and Prince put on probably the most memorable halftime show ever, and he did it in a virtual downpour. And I'm pretty sure it was the Bears Colts Super Bowl that the Colts won, giving Tony Dungy his only Super Bowl victory.
Yeah, and I always like history because that history was the first time there was two African American coaches, like head coaches, playing in the Super Bowl. Um, and they were both Lovie Smith of the Chicago Bears and Tony Dungy of Indianapolis Colts. I don't remember if I got to see that whole game or not. There was one of the Colts Super Bowls. There was either that one or the ones against the Saints that I had someone that just insisted on we go to a Chinese buffet and then drive around because they were bored. And I agreed to it and missed pretty much the entire Super Bowl. I don't remember which one that was, but like Super Bowl history is always really fun for me on like special facts and all. Like this year, congrats to all the teams going to the 2024, 2025 NFL playoffs because I think as of right now, we have Cincinnati, depending. I think there's like four teams that have never won a Super Bowl that are in contention of making it to the Super Bowl this year as a favorite. I believe that's Detroit, Minnesota, Buffalo. I'm forgetting the last one. It might be Cincinnati now. That I heard. I forgot who the last team is.
Well, Cincinnati, well,
Houston.
as of this taping, we don't know who all the teams are yet, Andrew, but you're
Yeah.
right. Detroit's never even been to a Super Bowl.
Same with
They're
Texas.
one of four. They're one of four teams that have never been to a Super Bowl, along with the Cleveland Browns, Jacksonville Jaguars, and the Houston Texans, and the Lions, who are one of the oldest teams in the NFL, have never been to a Super Bowl. So it would be nice to see the Lions finally get to a Super Bowl and make some noise. They're an excellent team. Like I said, as of this taping, we don't know. We know the Lions are in the playoffs. We don't know if they're going to be seeded number one or number five, or who they're going to be playing in the first round yet. We don't know any of that as of right now. The only thing we know for sure is Green Bay is going to be at Philadelphia either on Saturday or Sunday next weekend. But usually, getting to our topic, our theme of this podcast, Andrew, is Super Bowl history, and the reason we're already talking about the Super Bowl on that '70s pod is because in the '70s, when I was growing up, when I was uh, going from being 10 years old to 20 years old, um, the Super Bowl was always held in the second week of January. So right now, Andrew, if we were in the '70s right now, Andrew, we would be on that week that's in between the NFC AFC championship games and the Super Bowl, because they always had a 2 week break before the Super Bowl. So if we were in the '70s right now, we would be on that break looking forward to the Super Bowl, which would be this coming Sunday, um, which would be what, January 12th if it was this year and we were in the '70s. So that's the way it was in the '70s, Andrew. We were on the bye week right now and awaiting to see who was. We knew who was going to be in the Super Bowl, but we were awaiting the game. That's if again, if we were in the '70s, that's where we would be right now.
I am curious, real quick, because last week you were talking about the Vikings never winning a Super Bowl, but you said the Vikings won championships because before the Super Bowl, there was like the AFL leagues and the Vikings won championships and they were known as a really good team. Has Detroit ever won a championship before the Super Bowl days?
Yeah, you could say that's a really good point, Andrew. I couldn't tell you what year, but yeah, Detroit has been an NFL champion uh, either in the '50s or maybe 1960, I think was maybe the last time they were the NFL champions. Again, that was before the Super Bowl era. So They've never been in a Super Bowl, but they have been an NFL championship team. I just couldn't tell you what year because it was probably before I was born.
Gotcha. And I was on the phone with my brother the other day, and I told him about recording the podcast, part one of the Super Bowls. And he asked me, what year was the first Super Bowl? And I think maybe like 66 or 67, one of those two. And he was like, is that the different eras? Like, is this era called the Super Bowl era? Or like, has it changed? Like, is the NFL broken up in eras like that? If that
Well,
makes sense?
yeah, the Super Bowl, you're right. The Super Bowl, the very first one was in 1967, and it wasn't even called the Super Bowl. It was called the NFL AFL Championship game between the Green Bay Packers, who represented the NFL, and the Kansas City Chiefs, who represented the AFL. Now, these two teams, or rather, these two leagues, never played each other during the regular season, and it was just two different football leagues. Um, Kind of like back in the day when the American League and the National League never played each other during the regular season in baseball. The only time they played each other was in the World Series. So somebody came up with an idea that we have two football leagues, we should have a championship game. So in 1967, they had the first one uh, in at the Coliseum in Los Angeles, and it was only about half full because people didn't really know what to think about it, didn't really care about it. The Packers were heavily favored, and they beat the Chiefs 35-10. So it wasn't even really a close game, although it was 10-10 at halftime before the Packers opened it up. So, yeah, to answer your question, 1967 was kind of the start of a new era, but it was 4 years later when everything changed and the NFL became one league. There was no more AFL. The NFL and AFL merged together to make just one league, and then they had a AFC and NFC conference, which they still have. With Back then there was three divisions in each conference. There's four now because more teams have obviously been added over the years. So uh, that's kind of when everything really changed was in 1970 after Super Bowl four when the two leagues merged and there was just one NFL, excuse me, one NFL with two conferences, and that's where we are to this day.
And that's something I noticed last week while I was doing my research while we were talking, like impromptu, like I guess I didn't put that two together that like some divisions had five teams because every time I looked at the Miami or whatever AFC East, I would see that like the Colts were in that, and some divisions had five teams that they had to overcome throughout the season, and then just seeing like nowadays everybody watches college like on Christmas Day and New Year's Eve. Everybody was watching the NFC championship, AFC championship. It was just such a weird time how like more teams have been added. I guess that's 2002 or 2001. We've had 32 teams now with the Houston Texas being the last team. And just like football's so more it seems so much organized. Um But whenever I watch old 70s or 80s clip, I feel like I'm watching just like these big men on the field. And I know we did a boxing episode a few weeks ago. And like you mentioned how boxing was just these old, like rugged men. And that's kind of how I felt about baseball, basketball, football. And like I know that was a really big thing back when we had people like the purple people eaters, right? Which will lead us to our first topic of the day. I believe Super Bowl nine, it was that the Vikings were pretty much at the top of their game that they have been up to this point, correct?
Well, the 19 that would be the 1974 season. Um, the Vikings they started out the year 5-0, and just to recap, the Vikings had been in the Super Bowl the previous year against the Miami Dolphins, who were still flying high, after their undefeated season in '72. And in '73, they went back to the Super Bowl and beat the Vikings. Um, so by 1974, the Vikings were ready to give it another shot, and they started 5-0, lost a couple of games in week 6 and 7, wound up finishing 10-4, which certainly wasn't the best record that the Vikings have ever put together. Usually they're like a 12-2 team whenever they go to the Super Bowl. So they beat, I want to say, the St. Louis Cardinals. At that time, the Cardinals were in St. Louis. They beat St. Louis in the first round and then played the Rams at Old Metropolitan Stadium in Bloomington in the second round and beat the Rams and wound up going to the Super Bowl against Pittsburgh. Now, a lot of people were a little surprised because Pittsburgh played the Raiders in the AFC Championship game, and so most of us thought the Raiders were going to win that game and play the Vikings in Super Bowl IX. But the Steelers, I knew about the Steelers because of Franco Harris. Franco Harris is an outstanding running back. Terry Bradshaw was coming into his own at quarterback, but I knew nothing about their defense. And I kept hearing about this steel curtain defense, and I didn't know what it was all about. I know they had Mean Joe Green, who's famous for doing that Coca-Cola commercial with the little kid back in the '70s. Um, but I really didn't know about Ernie Holmes or L.C. Greenwood or Dwight White, I think his name was. They had outstanding linebackers, Jack Ham and Jack Lambert. Uh, Great defensive backfield, Mel Blunt. Uh, a guy named Wagner. I don't remember all of them now, but they just had a solid defense, and they didn't score a lot of points um, because they were basically a running team with Franco Harris. This is before they had Lynn Swan and John Stallworth as receivers. So their principal receiver was a guy named Ron Shanklin. Um, so they weren't so much a passing team as they were a running team with Rocky Blyer and Franco Harris in the backfield. And but it was that defense, Andrew. They played incredible defense, and they earned their way to a Super Bowl against the Vikings. And the Vikings were actually favored in this Super Bowl because it was their third Super Bowl, and the Steelers, it was their first time there. And for many years, Pittsburgh had been in the NFL for a long time, and they were always kind of the joke of the league. So this was a big deal for the Steelers and the city of Pittsburgh and this whole state of Pennsylvania that the Steelers were in the Super Bowl. It was a huge deal, and that set the stage for Super Bowl IX.
How much do you remember how much the Vikings were favored to win by?
I don't. I think they were favored by 5. But here's another interesting tidbit: is the Super Bowl was in New Orleans. Okay, so originally the Super Bowl was supposed to be in this brand spanking new stadium called the Superdome. And for whatever reason, the stadium wasn't ready. The Super Bowl was supposed to be inside at the brand New Orleans Superdome, but it didn't happen. So they had to have the game at Old Tulane Stadium in New Orleans, where the Saints played, and the Vikings actually had played there in Super Bowl IV against the Chiefs, so they were familiar with the stadium. Plus, they had played the Saints there as well. But it was, you talked earlier about, do you remember a bad weather day? Yeah, I do. It was Super Bowl IX. It was cold. It was raining. I think they had record low temperatures in New Orleans that day, where uh, temperatures were in the 30s. I think. I don't even think they broke 40. It was raining and cold, and there was missed field goals and blocked field goals and a blocked punt. The footing was really bad. Um, People were falling down when they were trying to run the football. Um, and it was actually a close game, Andrew. I can remember I was in seventh grade at the time, and I could remember telling a buddy of mine, Rich Gartner, in math class, uh, that I was basically a, a stupid 12-year-old kid who said, "Yeah, if the Vikings win, I'm going to come in with a hangover." Well, I didn't even know what a hangover was, and why would a 12-year-old kid have a hangover? Um, I mean, I wasn't even at a Super Bowl party. I watched the game pretty much by myself in my living room. So anyway, he asked me the next day about about this supposed party that was at my house that didn't exist because I was just a 12-year-old shooting my mouth off. And I said, "Oh yeah, we canceled it at halftime." And he said it was only 2-0 at halftime. And I said, "Yeah, but we knew the Vikings were going to lose." So anyway, I don't even know why I told you that story. It had nothing to do with the game, but the Vikings did trail 2-0 at halftime. So this was the first time that in a Super Bowl that two teams were held without a field goal or a touchdown, and the only scoring in the first half of this game was a safety by Pittsburgh, and that safety happened because of the bad weather. Fran Tarkenton, deep in his own territory, went to hand off the ball to Dave Osborne, a running back, and there was a miscue in the handoff, and the ball hit the ground and bounced towards the end zone. Fran Tarkenton ran and covered up the ball and in the end zone because he didn't want Pittsburgh to get an easy touchdown. So Fran Tarkenton covered the ball and he was touched by L.C. Greenwood of Pittsburgh. And that was it. That was the scoring in the first half, a safety. So it was 2-0 at the end of the first half in Super Bowl IX, where neither team was getting any good footing in this game.
Do you clearly remember watching this game in the living room? And was anybody else in your family interested? Like, were you able to watch an entire game?
I watched the entire game and uh, well, Super Bowl 8 and 9, just an exciting time for me being a Viking fan and getting to see the Vikings in the Super Bowl and knowing they'd be on the cover of Sports Illustrated and all that. So yeah, I did. I watched it from start to finish. The Vikings had a rookie receiver named Jackie Wallace who had to play in the game because somebody else was hurt, and he did a wonderful job at containing uh, whatever receiver for Pittsburgh that he was covering. So in the second half, Pittsburgh did put together a drive. Franco Harris had a big game, Andrew. He had 158 yards rushing, which at the time was the most yards rushing in a Super Bowl by any running back, and he was the game's MVP. And the Steelers came out and scored in the third quarter and went ahead 9-0 after the extra point. And towards the end of the third quarter, the Vikings blocked a punt um, and scooped up the ball and got a touchdown. Terry Brown was who scored the touchdown for the Vikings, and the extra point because of the weather was missed, so it was 9-6. So the Vikings went into the fourth quarter trailing 9-6. So the Vikings were actually in this Super Bowl because in Super Bowls 4 and 8, they really weren't in it by the fourth quarter. But going into the fourth quarter of this one, Andrew, the Vikings very much in this game, trailing only 9-6.
And I had a random, like you mentioned earlier, because I want to talk about the Super Bowls. We're going to talk about the games, right? But I also want to ask you side questions. You said you weren't really familiar with the Pittsburgh Steelers in this game, other than like just the headliners and like the big names. And one name you mentioned, it made me think of this, was Mean Joe Green. And you're right, he had that Pepsi commercial with throwing like the jersey to the kid in the tunnel. So I guess this is my two-part question because nowadays you just see the people who are like the big hits. Was that commercial, was he casted because he was already a big star, or did that commercial get him to be a bigger star? And then my part two of this question, was there any other commercials or ads at the time with NFL players in it that you remember in the 70s?
Well, there wasn't a lot of them. I'm not really sure how Mean Joe Green wound up being in that commercial, um, but they had to do quite a few takes, and Mean Joe Green drank a lot of Coke before they got a take that they liked. Um, there were, to answer the first part of your question, Mean Joe Green was already a pretty well-known player. He had been in the league a couple of years. He was an outstanding defensive tackle or defensive end. I don't remember if he was in the middle or on the end. Um, yeah, and the commercial made him even more famous. Um, and he told a story years later that kids were always, trying to give him Coke because they wanted a free jersey. Uh, so, he kind of had to put the kibosh on that because, kids everywhere wanted a Mean Joe Green jersey. So, yeah. The second part of your question, uh, athletes did do some beer commercials from time to time. Um, Light beer from Miller used to have some pretty funny commercials, and they would use former athletes, basketball, baseball, hockey, uh, boxing, just all kinds of different former athletes. Some were current athletes. I remember Burt Jones of the Colts was one of them. Bubba Smith of the Colts was another one. So yeah, occasionally athletes would show up on TV commercials, but not like they do today.
So, do you remember the halftime show for Super Bowl nine? And then, if not, tell me the rest of the fourth quarter. What happened?
Well, we mentioned this last week that halftime shows weren't a thing. They'd maybe have some high school bands or college bands or something. But it wasn't until Michael Jackson in the whatever Super Bowl in the mid '80s did his halftime show that halftime shows became a big deal. They just weren't a big deal in the '70s, Andrew. So going to that fourth quarter, the Vikings only trailing by three. Pittsburgh put together a drive midway through the fourth quarter where they scored again, made the score 16-6. And the Vikings could never get anything going in this game. They only had oh heck, I want to say 17 yards rushing in the game, 133 yards total offense. There was one pass play where Tarkington hit John Gilliam in stride as he was heading to the end zone, and Mel Blunt hit John Gilliam uh, and jarred the ball loose, and the ball went straight up in the air, and then it was intercepted. So that was probably the Vikings' best chance to score, and maybe you've seen that in the highlights, or people maybe remember that from the game where it looked like the Vikings were going to get a touchdown, and then John Gilliam just got nailed by Mel Blunt, and ball went straight up in the air and was intercepted by the Steelers. So that was the Vikings' best shot to score an offensive touchdown, but they didn't get shut out. They lost 16-6, and that game the was the lowest scoring Super Bowl for I don't know how many years before the Patriots and Rams broke that record a few years ago.
So, was this looked as worse than the Blunder Bowl?
No, no, this was a really hard fought game, and the conditions for kicking was kind of what the problem was. There were missed field goals. There was a missed extra point. There was a blocked punt. I mean, whenever you get a frozen field, and it like I said, it was raining, it was cold, the footing was terrible, and whenever you get that, um, it's hard to kick the football. it's hard to hang on to the football. The Blunder Bowl that you're referring to in Super Bowl five, the conditions were fine that day. That was just two teams that fumbled and had a lot of problems, but it wasn't because of the weather. Where Super Bowl nine with the Vikings and Steelers, it was because of the weather.
So the game ends, Steelers win. How does it make you feel? Like, what do you think of watching this as a kid?
Yeah, I was mad. I didn't expect the Vikings to beat the Dolphins the year before. I was just glad they were there, but I really thought the Vikings would win this one, and it made me mad. I didn't like the feeling of losing. I mean, now the Vikings are 0-3. A lot of teams uh, hadn't even been to the Super Bowl, and the Vikings had been there three times and lost all of them. Dallas uh, had been there twice. Uh, the Dolphins had been there three times, won two, lost one. The Vikings also been there three times, but they lost all three of them. So it was really hard, Andrew. It was. I granted I was only 12 years old, but it was tough. Um, so the following year, the Vikings came back and had this great season. They were 12-2 going into the playoffs, and that's they were favored to return to the Super Bowl again, and probably play the Steelers again. But this time, the Dallas Cowboys won on a Hail Mary pass. They beat the Vikings in the first round of the playoffs when Roger Staubach threw from 50 yards. He threw it to Drew Pearson, who either tripped, pushed, or did something to Nate Wright, the Vikings defender, caught the ball and scored a touchdown, and Dallas won the game and wound up going to the Super Bowl against Pittsburgh. And that would have been Super Bowl 10. I think that one was in Miami. Yeah, it was at the Orange Bowl, and I didn't watch a lot of that Super Bowl, Andrew, because I was mad the Vikings weren't there. I thought Dallas cheated, and so I didn't really care to watch the game. Although I've seen many highlights of that game since then because of the miraculous catches of Lynn Swann, who became the most valuable player as Pittsburgh won their second straight Super Bowl.
How do you think the Cowboys cheated in that game against the Vikings?
Well, because they in the Hail Mary pass where they won the game, it was clear that Drew Pearson, the receiver for Dallas, pushed Nate Wright, so it should have been offensive pass interference, and he never should have gotten a touchdown to win the game. So I've never liked Dallas anyway, and I'm tired of hearing about America's team. And in the '70s, that was a huge deal. I went to school with kids Jeff Stacken, who comes and fixes my washer and dryer now whenever they break. He was a huge Dallas Cowboy fan, and just got tired of hearing about the Cowboys all the time. And the Packers weren't really any good in the '70s, so there were a lot of Wisconsin kids that liked the Dallas Cowboys because they didn't want to be Viking fans. So I heard about Dallas a lot. I didn't like Dallas, and then they go and push Fran Tarkenton, and I just didn't want to have anything to do with the Dallas Cowboys. And I'm glad Pittsburgh beat them in Super Bowl 10.
And I am curious. You obviously watch the Vikings game. You watch 8 and 9, and then you watch every Vikings game. Did you have like a shirt or a jersey or something that you wore at the time for Vikings?
The only jersey I had as a kid was a Buffalo Bill jersey of O.J. Simpson. Um, and I just always liked the Buffalo Bills. They were really very good in the '70s. I think they made the playoffs once against Pittsburgh in 1975 or 1976, and Pittsburgh beat them. I don't remember them ever being in the playoffs after that. In the '70s, anyway. In the '80s, of course, they made some noise and went to four straight Super Bowls. But in the '70s, I had an O.J. Simpson jersey from the Buffalo Bills, and that was the only jersey that I had.
Wait, O.J. Simpson, the actor? I'm joking. Okay.
O.J. Simpson, the apparent double murderer. but I guess we'll never know that. He passed away a couple of years ago. Um,
This year.
so anyway, yeah. But when he played football, he was fun to watch. He's the only 2,000-yard rusher that did it in a 14 game schedule. I know there's been some others, including Saquon Barkley this year, over 2,000 yards rushing. But you do that in a 16 game schedule. It's not as impressive as OJ doing it in 14 games.
And that was actually this past April. OJ Simpson passed away of this year in 2024,
Okay.
or his last calendar year. But as you mentioned, something that we weren't sure of, but something we were sure of was now you're watching a decade of the Super Bowls. We're at Super Bowl 10, where the Cowboys make it again. I know you said you didn't really watch the game, but was that, I guess you were in eighth grade, so you're about 14, 15 years old at the time. Like, what do you remember? Like watching highlights on the radio? Was your brother watching it? Were people talking about the next day at school? Like, what's your memory of Super Bowl 10?
Well, I think I was actually out with my buddies playing football because I don't really remember watching the game. I did turn it on briefly, and I saw a blocked punt that either wound up as a safety or yeah, I think it was a safety. And I don't even remember who blocked the punt. If it was Dallas or Pittsburgh, and the ball went out of the end zone, so it was a safety. Uh, the Steelers wound up winning the game 21-17. Um, and like I said, Lynn Swan made so many great catches in that game, and everybody knew who Lynn Swan was after Super Bowl 10. Just a phenomenal game, and you can look up highlights of Super Bowl 10, and the first thing you're going to see is Lynn Swan making all these great catches to beat the Pittsburgh or to beat the Dallas Cowboys.
He wasn't there for Super Bowl 9.
I don't think he was there, but he didn't factor in the game. Uh, Again, it wasn't really uh, Super Bowl 9 because of the weather. The Pittsburgh kept it on the ground. Franco Harris had a big day running the football. So did Rocky Blyer. So Pittsburgh actually didn't pass the ball all that much in Super Bowl 9 like they did in Super Bowl 10.
All right, so let's jump right into Super Bowl 11. What do you remember about the following year?
Well, a lot. The Vikings had another good year. They were 11-2-1, and wound up playing the Redskins in the first round. Chuck Foreman, my all time favorite Viking, had over 100 yards rushing, as did Brent McClanahan, who was the other Viking running back that day. So the Vikings had two running backs over 100 yards. They beat the Washington Redskins in the first round, beat the Rams again in the championship game, and they thought they were going to have to play Pittsburgh again, but this time it didn't happen. The Oakland Raiders finally won an AFC championship game after losing so many, whether it was the Steelers, the Dolphins, whatever. And the Raiders were on their way to the Super Bowl. And the Vikings knew that they were going to be playing the Raiders. And I can remember Fran Tarkenton, the quarterback of the Vikings, saying in the locker room uh, after they had won the NFC Championship game against the Rams. I can remember Tarkington being interviewed by CBS Sports Brett Musburger and said, "Yeah, we're not going to lose this one," and kind of famous last words that they knew they were going to the Super Bowl again, and Tarkington said, "We're not losing this one." Well, here comes Super Bowl 11, and this was the earliest Super Bowl, Andrew, on record, and to this day, and for all time, it will be the earliest Super Bowl held. It was on January 9th, and this would have been in 1977, I think. Yeah, 1977, coming off the 76 season. So um, it was an early Super Bowl. It was the second Sunday in January. So, that was pretty much the rule. But the Vikings came out in Super Bowl 11, and I was watching this game. I was a freshman in high school, and the Vikings came out sky high, and the Raiders got the opening kickoff, and they won the toss, and they elected to receive, and the Vikings came out and they stopped the Raiders on three straight plays, and so the Raiders had to punt. Now the Raiders had a punter named Ray Guy. First name Ray, second last name Guy, Guy. And this guy, just a phenomenal punter, had never had a punt blocked ever. I don't remember how many years he had been in the league, but he kicked the ball so hard and so high. Nobody had ever blocked a kick by this guy. Well, guess what, Andrew? The Vikings came after him and they blocked Ray Guy early in the football game. They recovered the ball on the 2 yard line. The Vikings were sky high. They were on the Raider 2 yard line, and all they had to do was run the ball in. Um, Chuck Foreman took the first carry, and they stopped him for no gain. The second carry went to Brent McClanahan, and he fumbled the football. And the Raiders recovered it, and that was it. All the momentum the Vikings had going into that game, stopping the Raiders on their opening series, blocking a punt, getting the ball on the 2 yard line. All they had to do was punch it in, and they would have had an early 7-0 lead. But instead, the Raiders from their own 2 yard line, they had a running back named Clarence Davis that reeled off a 37-yard run to get the Raiders out of their own end zone and close to midfield, and they just drove right down the field and scored. And I think they only got a field goal, but the Raiders just pounded the Vikings. Lots of yardage. Run. Clarence Davis had over 100 yards. Uh, they had another running back named Pete Banaszak who had a bunch of yards. The receivers, Cliff Branch and Fred Bolitnikoff, they were catching passes all over the field. Dave Casper, their tight end, was catching uh, lots of passes. So Raiders pounded the Vikings, wound up winning 32-14. So maybe it was 32-13. I don't remember. But once again, Vikings lose a Super Bowl, and once again, it was heartbreaking because the Vikings came out so sky high. I was so proud they blocked that punt, and they wound up not scoring and gave the ball up and just got pounded all game. Wound up losing the game, and so once again, the Vikings another Super Bowl. So we have 11 Super Bowls. The Vikings have been in four of them and lost all four, and the Raiders go on to be the NFL champions for that year.
So let's talk about the Vikings and the Raiders a little bit of this year because you said the Vikings like kind of lost momentum and they weren't ever able to catch back up. They were kind of like falling behind. Did they have that interview sounds pretty confident going into the Super Bowl? But did they have confidence issues during the season? Like, do you remember that tie game that they had in the 76 season?
Yeah, that was against the Rams. It was like the second game of the year. It was 10-10, and uh, I remember the Rams lined up to kick a winning field goal, and the Vikings blocked it, and so the game ended being tied at 10-10. And the Vikings also blocked another field goal attempt by the Rams in the NFC Championship game, and uh, Bobby Bryant for the Vikings wound up picking up the ball and running 90 yards for a touchdown. And that set the tone of the game in the NFC Championship, where the Rams thought they were going to have a 3-0 lead, and all of a sudden they're down 7-0 because of a blocked field goal kick. And the Vikings returning it for a touchdown. The Vikings blocked a lot of kicks that year, and 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 then after blocking that punt in the Super Bowl, people thought this is going to do it. We're going to be blocking kicks, we're going to be getting easy touchdowns, and it just didn't happen. So that's the way it goes. The last time the Vikings were in a Super Bowl was Super Bowl 11, and they've come close a couple of times to getting back there in '98 and 2017 and 2009. But we'll see this year if they can get back.
Wow, they didn't really do anything in the '80s and the early '90s. It wasn't until '98.
'98 they had that wonderful team that went 15-1, and they were in the NFC Championship game, a game I was at the Metrodome against the Atlanta Falcons, and the Vikings were heavily favored. Um, Game wound up going into overtime, and Atlanta kicked a field goal to win it. So they went to the Super Bowl and lost to Denver. Um, and the Vikings, like I said, they haven't been back there. They had a good shot in 2009 when they had Brett Favre. Uh, I think it was 2009. I want to say it was 2009. They played the Saints in the NFC Championship game, and the Vikings had a chance to win that game in regulation. They had too many men on the field and were called for a penalty. The game wound up going into overtime. And uh, this was back when overtime was the first team to score. And the Saints won the toss and went down the field and kicked a field goal. Vikings never even got a chance to touch the ball in overtime, and so that rule changed the following year, where both teams would get a chance to score in overtime before they decided a winner. But that particular year, the rule wasn't in effect yet, so the Saints went to the Super Bowl and beat the Colts.
So I have a handful of questions before we jump into our next Super Bowl. You did mention you were at that 1998 game. I'm curious, was that the first Vikings game or like NFL game you were ever at?
Yeah, actually, it was. I knew a guy um, that had season tickets, and he called me and said, "Hey, do you want to go?" And yeah, I'll go to an NFC Championship game, and it was so much fun. The Vikings were so much fun that year. Uh, that's when Randall Cunningham came out of retirement and quarterbacked the Vikings that year because Brad Johnson was hurt, and Randy Moss was a rookie. Uh, Chris Carter was in his prime. They had Robert Smith in the backfield, excellent running back. They were just so explosive, and they scored more points than anybody else had scored in a regular season. Up to that point, the Patriots beat that several years later. Uh, but the Vikings, they dominated every single game. They blew out the Cardinals in the first round of the playoffs, and then ran into the Falcons and lost. And, and people were so confident the Vikings were going to go to the Super Bowl that year against Denver that they had already been printing programs featuring the Broncos and Vikings on the cover, but they kind of had to change that because the Falcons went instead of the Vikings.
Who was the Broncos? Who did the Broncos beat that year?
In the AFC Championship,
Yeah.
I really don't remember. Uh, they That was John Elway's last year at quarterback for the Broncos. The previous year they had beaten the Packers in the Super Bowl in '98 or the '97-'98 season, and so they were back for another shot at it. And I was really mad the Vikings weren't in that Super Bowl. They should have been. Um, I remember the game was in it was in Los Angeles, and and Cher sang the national anthem. Kiss, who were in the midst of doing a reunion tour with the original band members, and during that time, they performed before the show. They didn't do the halftime show. They performed before the show or before the game, uh, where they did shout it out loud and rock and roll all night. So I'm just going, yeah, Cher is there, one of my favorite performers. Kiss is there, why aren't the Vikings there? So that was kind of tough to watch. I did watch that game, and I'm glad the Broncos pounded the Falcons, but woulda, shoulda, coulda. Vikings still trying to get back to a Super Bowl after not being there since 1977.
So in '77 they lose, and now the Vikings are 0-4. Is this when punishments started to happen and people getting let go? Because you hear about that a lot. Obviously, the NFL is a public traded company. Like 2 hours ago, the New England Patriots just announced that they released their manager or their head coach, the guy who replaced Bill Belichick. He just got released 2 hours ago because the Patriots had such a terrible season. Is this kind of the time releases and firings started happening with managers, or were you not really watching like ESPN or reading the newspaper or anything like that quite yet?
Well, in the 70s, we didn't have ESPN. We still had just four channels, like we've
Okay.
mentioned on many other podcasts. The 70s just didn't have a lot of media. We would hear things uh, like maybe we would hear the Packers fire their coach. Packers went through a lot of coaches in the 70s. Uh, Minnesota had Bud Grant. So you weren't going to fire Bud Grant. Bud Grant was an icon in Minnesota, and he wasn't going to be fired. So we didn't have to worry about that. And in the following year, in the 77 season, the Vikings didn't have a real great record. They finished 9-5, but they still went to the playoffs and beat the Rams in Los Angeles and one of the muddiest games on record. The Rams were heavily favored, but there was this downpour the day of the game, and the field was just totally mud. And the Vikings won the game 14-7, and and beat the Rams yet again. They were they had beaten the Rams like five times in the playoffs, and the Rams just couldn't beat the Vikings in the playoffs. So the Vikings went and beat, or rather, met Dallas in the NFC Championship game. They didn't have Fran Tarkenton; he was out hurt. So their backup quarterback Bob Lee uh, uh, tried to do his best against a fired up Dallas team, but Dallas was they had missed the past. Uh, well, they were at Super Bowl 10. They wanted to get back there, of course. As we talked about last week, it was either Dallas or Minnesota in 9 of the 10 Super Bowls in the 70s, with the Washington Redskins being the other. Um, so Dallas made it back that year. Uh, got to this time actually play in the Superdome. It was ready this time, and they met the Denver Broncos. Craig Morton, who used to be a Cowboy, was quarterbacking the Denver Broncos now. The Dallas just annihilated them. 27-10 was the finish there, and uh, Dallas just they had a good defense. They had good offensive weapons, um, and it just basically just destroyed Denver. It wasn't even a close game. So that's what I remember about Super Bowl 12 is Dallas winning 27-10.
So you mentioned like Dallas. I just think of '70s Dallas, like it's a dynasty. People talk about the cheerleaders, they talk about the players, the look and everything. But the game before the Vikings and the Raiders, I remember being in middle school football and taking my football picture. It was either me or my brother. I remember you look at it like, oh, look at that haircut. It looks like a '70s, like a 1970s, like Raiders haircut. Because like apparently they all kind of looked alike. Was that like a thing where rather if it was the Raiders or the Cowboys, where it was more than just a good football team? Because like 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, we had the Bengals and the Rams in the Super Bowl. It wasn't that exciting of a Super Bowl. I think it was just kind of made for like the Rams to win it. But like the Bengals were a really good team. But they did not get as much ratings as they do when this quote unquote dynasty, the Kansas City Chiefs, were in it. So is that kind of the time where like the Raiders, more so the Cowboys, was like this attraction that was happening in the NFL?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, Dallas was, I don't know who dubbed them America's team, but that's kind of what they were. You didn't have to live in Texas to be a Dallas Cowboy fan. A lot of people just like Dallas. Uh, the Raiders, on the other hand, Andrew, were more of a rebellious team. They were known for being a hard hitting football team, for taking cheap shots. Uh, they had really good offensive linemen in Art Shell and Gene Upshaw, who later went on to be the head of the Players Union for the NFL. Uh, and yeah, they all had long hair. The quarterback Kenny Stabler had long hair. Dave Casper, the tight end, you could see hair coming out of his helmet, which was unheard of in the '70s. Fred Biletnikoff, the receiver, had long hair. The African American players had big afros that you could see coming out through the helmet. So yeah, it was kind of a status thing. The Raiders were just always the bad guy, the black and silver. Uh, they were kind of like the heels of professional wrestling, only this was professional football. So yeah, that's what the Raiders were known for, was being kind of that rebellious team, uh, and a bunch of players that hit hard, maybe took some cheap shots. Um, but John Madden was the coach, and they were a fun team. They were a good team, fun team to watch. They only made the Super Bowl that one time against the Vikings, but they were I think they won more games in the '70s. Well, maybe the Steelers did, but the Raiders were right up there. Either number one or number two in games won in the '70s.
That was the Rams, correct? Or I mean, Los Angeles, correct?
At that time, they were the Oakland Raiders.
Okay. Okay, because I know them and Cowboys, and then in the '80s, it kind of became like the Rams and the Bears were like the big teams, right? And then they were recording like music videos and everything.
Well, yeah, the Bears had the Bears shuffle. The Bears were really good uh, in what was it, '84 or '85. They were 15-1, won the Super Bowl easily over the Patriots. Wasn't even close. Um, and yeah, the Bears were just a big thing in the mid '80s. Winning that Super Bowl is the only time the Bears have won a Super Bowl. And other than the Packers, nobody in the NFC North has ever won a Super Bowl. The Packers have won four of them. The Bears have won one. Vikings have never won one, and the Lions have never been there. So uh, I guess the Packers are kind of our best representative of Super Bowl history.
So you've heard the Bears shuffle. Have you ever heard of the Rams song "Ram It"?
I have not.
Go look that up on YouTube. Like nowadays, I mean, to be honest, it doesn't really age well with some of the lyrics. Um, yeah, it's kind of funny when you think of it now. And so the Vikings are no longer in the Super Bowl contention. You said they tried to make it that year, but they got passed by the Cowboys making it. I'm a Miami Dolphins fan. People always talk about Dan Marino being such a great quarterback that never won a Super Bowl. Is Frank Tarkenton like number two in that list?
Well, there's been other great quarterbacks that have never won a Super Bowl. Um, well, for a while, we didn't think John Elway would win a Super Bowl. I think he had lost three of them before he finally beat the Packers, and then he beat the Falcons. So he wound up winning a couple of them, but for a while, it didn't look like Elway was going to win a Super Bowl. The Browns had this great quarterback named Bernie Kosar. Uh, in the '80s, who uh, people thought maybe the Browns were actually going to make a Super Bowl. but they would always run into the Broncos and lose in the AFC Championship game. So Bernie Kosar was a great quarterback who never won a Super Bowl. Another one would have been Buffalo's Jim Kelly. Jim Kelly got Buffalo to the Super Bowl 4 years in a row, and they lost all four. So that was even worse than the Vikings. So Jim Kelly is actually 0 and 4 in the Super Bowl. Fran Tarkington is 0 and 3. So Jim Kelly has the dubious record of being in four Super Bowls and not winning any of the four.
I guess I didn't even ask you this. What were we talking about? Super Bowl 11. Did you watch that live?
I watched all of these live. Yes.
Okay. Well, I know you said Super Bowl 10, you're kind of hit or miss, uh, or whatever one that was.
Yeah, that's because I was mad at Dallas, but I did watch it the following year when they beat the Broncos, and then in Super Bowl 13, uh, Vikings made the playoffs uh, with a horrible record. This was the first year, Andrew. Up until now, we're always talking about the Vikings being 12-2 or 10-4 or 9-5, playing a 14 game schedule. Well, in 1978 is when the NFL went to a 16 game schedule. So the Vikings finished 8-7-1 that year, and they tied the Packers for the first place in the division, but they beat the Packers in head-to-head competition. Um, in one game and tied with the Packers in the other game. So the Vikings wound up getting the nod to go to the playoffs again. And people were tired, I think, at that point of seeing the Vikings in the playoffs all the time. And they this time they played the Rams, and it was a sunny day in Los Angeles. And even though the game was tied 10-10 at halftime, the Rams went on to finally beat the Vikings and knock them out of the playoffs in the first round. So uh, we actually had a repeat of Super Bowl 13. The Pittsburgh Steelers and the Dallas Cowboys met again, this time at the Orange Bowl in Miami. Um, I think the other time they met in Super Bowl 10 was also in Miami. Anyway, this Super Bowl, I remember watching this one, Andrew, and this one was one to remember. This game went right down to the wire. Uh, Pittsburgh would go ahead, Dallas would tie it. Pittsburgh would go ahead, Dallas would tie it. Pittsburgh would go ahead, Dallas would tie it. I mean, it was like this the whole game, and finally it got down to where it was 28-28. Pittsburgh scored um, on a long pass play, of course, to Lynn Swan. Um, and so Pittsburgh was ahead 35-28. Dallas was driving down the field. They had no trouble moving the ball up and down the field against Pittsburgh that day. And Staubach went back to pass, and he had a wide open Jackie Smith in the end zone. And Jackie Smith slid to catch the ball. It was right in his gut, and he lost control of the ball, and it was on a fourth down, or no, it was on third down, um, and so it was an easy touchdown. Nobody was around him. Jackie Smith couldn't hang on to the ball. Staubach was upset. You could see it visibly by his body language. Jackie Smith was upset at himself. Just basically had a sort of a tantrum momentarily on the field. So Dallas went from tying the game to having to kick a field goal. So that made the score 35-31, and that's how it ended, with Pittsburgh beating Dallas again and winning their third Super Bowl in as many tries. And that one was really a good one. It was a really good Super Bowl, because most of the Super Bowls up to that point were kind of one sided. So this was a really good one. And I remember watching that one, Terry Bradshaw beating Roger Staubach again, and two great Hall of Fame quarterbacks. And man, it was a good one. Super Bowl 13 was a good one.
Did Lynn Swan stand out again in that game?
Yeah, he had a long touchdown pass that Bradshaw didn't even see. Bradshaw let go of the ball, and he was just nailed by Harvey Martin or Ed Too Tall Jones, one of them. And Swan caught the ball in the end zone for the touchdown. Terry Bradshaw never even saw it because he was nailed, and I think he had to leave the game momentarily because uh, he just got pummeled on the play, but wound up being a touchdown. So uh, that's how it was in games with the Steelers and Cowboys. So those two teams just went at each other, and they had a couple of good Super Bowls. One of them I watched.
I take it this was you were still at your parents' house watching in the living room, correct?
No, this would have been my years um, living in. My dad owned a bar uh, outside of New Richmond, and so this would have been. We had living quarters in the back of the bar, so that's where I watched the game.
Okay, so that Super Bowl 13, that would have been January, so 1979.
That was 1979, so that would have been the last Super Bowl in the 70s, and that's also when the Super Bowl started being a little bit later. That was actually January 21st when that Super Bowl was held. Because of the 16 game schedule, the Super Bowl started to get pushed back farther and farther, and and the following year, the 1979 season, the Vikings didn't make the playoffs. They were actually in the same division as the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that year, and Tampa Bay almost went to the Super Bowl, but the Rams beat them in the NFC Championship game 9-0, and the Rams went to the Super Bowl against the Raiders, a game that would have been played in January of 1980. And that one was really a good one too. The Rams were right in it till the very end, uh, and Steelers scored a couple of late touchdowns with Terry Bradshaw hitting John Stallworth. But Rams put they finally made it to a Super Bowl. They did a really good game with Vince Ferragamo at quarterback for the Rams, and I can remember going to. There were a couple of Rams fans in high school. Uh, Brian Harstead was somebody I graduated with who uh, later became my neighbor when we lived on Derrick Drive in Richmond. He lived across the street. Uh, so he was a huge Rams fan, and another guy that he hung out with decided he should be a Rams fan too. So yeah, I had a couple of Rams fans in high school, which was a little different. They even were had jerseys that they were wearing. So uh, that was kind of it. You know, I think people were glad that the Vikings were done being in Super Bowls or in contention for a Super Bowl. Matter of fact, a joke was made that sending the Vikings to another Super Bowl would be like sending a stick man to fight a fire. Uh, so people were just tired of seeing the Vikings be around, and that was at the end of the '70s. That kind of marked the end of the Vikings being in contention for Super Bowls, as they never were again until 1998.
And that marks the end of this episode as we're wrapping up. I know last week how we wrapped up part one, we kind of just talked about the 70s, how it was like a lot of the same teams, a lot of the good teams. And that was like when I was in middle school, I saw a lot of the same teams there, like in the playoffs and the championships. You kind of saw like the Patriots, the Colts, the Giants, the Steelers. It's always kind of the same people. Now it's kind of the Eagles and the Chiefs and a few mixed in a little bit. But it seems like the 70s always mean a lot to you, especially when it comes to sports. Um, so I have like three quick questions as we're wrapping up. I mean, is there anything else you want to add? Is my first question when it comes to Super Bowls in the 70s, just like the coziness of you watching them being excited, talking at school? Like, what stands out the most of like the NFL season wrapping up for you as a kid in the '70s every
Well,
year?
you probably noticed a pattern in the 10 Super Bowls that I talked about. Is that well, first of all, most of the 70s there was a 14 game schedule, and then you would play one playoff game, and then you would play the the NFC Championship game, and then there was a Super Bowl. So you would the most playoff games you would have would be three. You'd have the first playoff game, you'd have the NFC or AFC Championship, and then you would have the Super Bowl. And that's the way it was for almost all of the 70s. And even when they went to that 16 game schedule in 1978, I think it was 78, wasn't it? Yeah. They still had a first round, an NFC championship, excuse me, and then a Super Bowl. So the playoff format really didn't change at all throughout the entire 70s. The number of games changed from 14 to 16 at the very end of the 70s, but the format of the playoffs never really changed. Well, nowadays, of course, it's way different. They've gone to a 17 game schedule. Um, there's talk about going to an 18 game schedule here in the next year or two. So the regular season is becoming longer. There's more teams that get to be in the playoffs now. Back in the 70s, Andrew, there was four teams from the AFC and four teams from the NFC, and that was it. Now there's seven teams from each conference that get to be in the playoffs, which extends the playoffs even longer. So that's why your Super Bowl is being played in February now. The purpose of this whole podcast the last 2 weeks is that the Super Bowl used to be at this time of year in the second week of January. That's why we're talking about the Super Bowl now instead of waiting till February, because in the 70s, I watched the Super Bowl in the second week of January, which is the time period we're at right now. Nowadays, though, because of a longer regular season, because of more teams being in the playoffs, the Super Bowl has been pushed way back and is in the second week of February now, which just a couple of years ago it used to be the first Sunday in February. Now it's the second Sunday in February. If they go to an 18 game schedule, Andrew, it'll be the third week of February. Pretty soon they'll have the Super Bowl on St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, who knows? I feel like more teams get added, more games get added. I think at one point there was 8 teams, and the top two seeds would get a bye in the first round, if I remember that correctly. If you like, while I was growing up. Um, okay, two questions left. My second one, we talked about weather. Obviously, you lived in the Midwest. It doesn't have to be the '70s, but like I know the Super Bowl has a soft spot in your heart, and that's gonna be my final question. But question number two, Minnesota Super Bowls. What was your experience, even if it's not the '70s? What memories do you remember of what Super Bowls that were held in Minneapolis, Minnesota?
Well, the Metrodome in Minneapolis had a Super Bowl between the Buffalo Bills and the Washington Redskins, and I want to say that was in 1991. I couldn't tell you what Super Bowl that was, but I remember I was working at a restaurant in New Richmond, Wisconsin at the time, and apparently they ran out of hotels in the Twin Cities, and so there was a hotel right across the street from the restaurant I worked at, and they had some Bills fans there, and they had some Redskins fans there, and they would come over and have dinner in the restaurant wearing their Bills gear or their Redskins gear every single night until, well, not every single night, but um, they basically would take some kind of a tour bus from New Richmond to the Twin Cities, and so they could take part in all the Super Bowl festivities during the week, and then they would come back to New Richmond and spend the night at the hotel, and come over to the restaurant I worked at and have supper. So that's what I remember most about the Super Bowl in Minneapolis between the Redskins and the Buffalo Bills, which the Redskins won. The other one was just a few years ago, was 2018, I want to say, where Philadelphia beat the New England Patriots uh, in that Super Bowl. That was one the Vikings maybe could have been in, and if the Vikings um, had of, if they would have had the number one seed that year, they had a really good record. They were 13-4. With a quarterback named Case Keenum, and they ran into the Philadelphia Eagles in the NFC Championship game, a game played in Philadelphia. If that game had been in Minnesota, I think the Vikings would have won, and then went on to be the first team to play at home in their own stadium. Um, but it didn't happen that way. The Vikings lost to Philadelphia in the NFC Championship game, and Philadelphia wound up getting to play in the Super Bowl and beating the Patriots, and a very well played game. The Eagles definitely deserve to beat the Patriots and win that Super Bowl. Patriots didn't lose in the Super Bowl very often, so that was a pretty big deal. Um, so that's what I remember most about the those two Super Bowls being in Minneapolis.
I remember you first telling me that one when you worked at Joseph's in '91, and being like, "Wait, the like the Redskins and the Bills made it a Super Bowl? Like they're terrible," and just like couldn't believe how like Oakdale, Stillwater, Hudson, like like they had to push all the way to New Richmond, Wisconsin, to find hotels.
Yeah,
Like that's just
kind
like
of,
crazy. Like how many people are traveling back then for Super Bowls.
yeah. Well,
And
uh, by the time the Vikings or Minnesota had its second Super Bowl, there was a lot more hotels, so nobody had to come out to New Richmond for that one.
okay, that's right. I guess I got thinking like '91. It's like Hudson alone probably only had like three or something. Final question of the night. I thank you for your time, by the way, always. As I'm wrapping up my destination and all, and our destination for this week's episode, because we're not doing a part three of Super Bowls or NFL or Pro Bowl or anything next week, correct?
No, I think we've pretty much exhausted this. I mean, we could talk about all the Super Bowls, in the '80s, '90s, and so forth. But the purpose of our podcast is remembering the '70s, and I think we've thoroughly covered all the Super Bowls that I watched in the '70s.
Well, that does leave my final question. I know, like, sometimes NBA championships, okay, Stanley Cup is cool, the World Series, but like, no matter what team's in it, Minnesota or not, it seems like you always pay a little bit more attention to the NFL. What does the Super Bowl mean to you?
Well, it used to mean a lot more. It was the bowl game of all bowl games. Because obviously I watched a little bit of college football in the '70s. The Rose Bowl was always a big deal because um, the Gophers were in the Big Ten with Ohio State and Michigan, and usually Ohio State or Michigan would represent the Big Ten in the Rose Bowl against USC or UCLA or one of the West Coast teams. So that was always a big deal to watch. The Rose Bowl was just that was kind of the epitome of college football. So the Super Bowl was the best teams in the NFL. So it was always exciting. No matter who was in the game, of course, I wanted to see the Vikings every year and remember very distinctly watching Super Bowls 8, 9, and 11 because the Vikings were in there. But uh, I still tried to watch Super Bowls at other times because it was just fun. It was the best teams in football. Super Bowl six was so much fun watching Dallas against Miami, and Super Bowl seven we talked about last week, where I watched that whole game to see if the Dolphins would go undefeated, uh, even though I bet against them and lost a quarter. So just I have so many memories of watching Super Bowls in the '70s, and then always looking forward to getting that Sports Illustrated issue of the Super Bowl a week after the game, and seeing the pictures and reading the articles. So yeah, it was just kind of all tied together. and made wonderful memories growing up in the 70s and watching football and then going out and playing football in the snow or whatever, because football was the sport in the 70s.
You're right. Like, I mean, hockey and everything's fun, but like watching football, playing football, especially NFL. I watch a little bit of college on New Year's Eve, but NFL, the Super Bowl is a can't miss event. Um, I always say that. Like, you gotta watch it like right away. Watch the pregame, the pre-show, the national anthem, the game itself, the halftime show. But it's like you can't look away or take a break because now commercials are a big deal. And like you want to see all the new commercials and how funny they are. And like I don't think the commercials and the halftime show and stuff, it wasn't a pageantry as it was now back then. But Super Bowl, some people argue it's scripted or like Taylor Swift and some hurricanes and things like that, wildfires. Um, they have a hand in the outcome. I can see it. I definitely have had my conspiracy theories with it, but no matter what, I'm going to watch it. I was not happy when the Chiefs and the Eagles were the two finalists 2 years ago, but I still watched it. It's just the Super Bowl is really fun. And like I said, it's a can't miss event, and we hope that this is a can't miss episode for you and a can't miss weekly show for you. This is that 70s Pod on YouTube where you can subscribe, comment, fave, like, share podcasts, share episodes with everybody else. That's that 70s Pod with Bryan Lee on YouTube. Please subscribe so you can get notification right away every time an episode is uploaded. We are now into, I believe, we're in our 30s when it comes to episodes. This is 2025, and we're going to keep rolling. We have our sponsors, as you can find in the description below. That's KingLineNutrition.com with the best snacking out there. Edible cookie dough is the biggest thing. Use the promo code Lockhart, LOCKHART, and then you can wear a football jersey watching the Super Bowl, but then you can also wear your face described T-shirt at King, wow, GodlyFatherApparel.com. That's GodlyFatherApparel.com with Lockhart15 as your promo code. That's Lockhart15. They were sold out, but now they have restock, so go in there and order. That's Lockhart15 at GodlyFatherApparel.com. I always enjoy filming these episodes. I'm in that NFL mood. It's just exciting. I've been watching the playoff picture online every day, every single day. I'm getting a notification right now. The Seahawks beat the Rams. Look at that. So the Buccaneers are the third seed. All right. Okay.
All right.
Look at that. Top. I'm getting live news as that's a giveaway that we're recording this on a Sunday. So the Seahawks beat the Rams. You never know what's going to happen. But like, it's just fun watching it. And yeah, it's been exciting all year, and it's been exciting recording these episodes. I'm signing off from Florida. You have a great night, everybody. You have a great night, Bryan. Any final words, and you could take it home for today's episode.
Well, thanks everyone for listening, the Super Bowl is something I was really passionate about in the 70s. And Andrew didn't even know I was going to talk about the Super Bowl last week. And I said, let's do a two-part episode. And Andrew was totally willing because he's also excited about Super Bowls and hearing about them in the past. And he's seen plenty of highlights as well of Super Bowls from the 70s. So it was great fun for me to kind of relive all of them and go through them chronologically from 1970 through 79. And looking forward to this year's Super Bowl. Hopefully, our favorite teams. I don't know if the Dolphins made it into the Super Bowl, but or into the playoffs this year. Um, I haven't had a chance to check, but we'll know all that by the next time we talk. Next week's podcast, not sure what the topic's going to be yet, but I'm sure we'll recap this episode and maybe make a few comments here and there about what's going to be happening in the playoffs in the NFL, because we want to keep you informed. We want to keep you abreast, not just of our memories from the 70s, but what's going on in current history as well. So have a great week, everyone. Hope you had a good New Year, and we'll talk to you again with a whole other topic from the 70s next week.